Hello, dear friends. Today is the 9th of June, Monday. The Economist writes that Russia has gone into a summer offensive. The military criminal Putin claims that Russia's victory is ensured. I have the impression that both Putin himself and his closest entourage know the history of their own country well, which proves that Russia is facing a serious defeat. And today I want to consider this issue, relying on the well-known, the little-known, and the facts, and some conclusions from these facts. Immediately pay attention to the fact that today we will go through, so to speak, on the verge of technical progress of recent achievements. Therefore, naturally, I do not know everything in this area, and even the fact that it is known may not be worth telling everything. I will only operate on the facts that are known. I just need to explain them, relying on the opinion and statements of these facts by analysts, professionals whom I know and respect. Let's first see what modern Russia is like, which started this offensive. You know that not so long ago, by means of Western mass media, a lot of information was published. However, about a few months ago, the Western mass media, well, probably the information was leaked by the special services. But then they picked it up, not understanding the depth of this question. The Western mass media talked about 2 million documents, which should be considered completely secret or even of special importance, which were leaked through the Russian state website, Russian agencies which were in charge of purchases, financing, expenses of the Ministry of Defense, according to various articles. Well, at first the mass media laughed at it, as if the Russians had made it easier or leaked so much information. I was very much looking for information, comments on this about Chinese sources, because the Chinese, who are considered Russia's closest allies at the moment, although this is not quite the case. So they probably know more than anyone what Russia is like, and we are interested in what kind of relationships there are between them. And so I found an article by Mr. Bayu Zhang. He is an aviator of space and aviation, who works at the Chinese Academy of Sciences. I pay attention. This is a very important state organization. That is, a person cannot write nonsense, and what he writes probably reflects, by and large, the point of view, maybe not of all, but of the well-known part of the state authorities of China and the Communist Party.
Я не буду все рассказывать, там целая история, интереснейший материал. Скажу только, что были раньше утечки информации по глупости, в результате действий разведчиков.
Hands of the Chinese, this is a very important point. I will tell you about it in my previous videos. There was a terrible leak of information from the United States of America, which was made by Edward Snowden, who fled to Russia. The danger of this leak for America was that the Americans did not know the entire depth of that massif, the entire volume of the massif that was leaked. And this was the most terrible thing, because they did not know if it was possible to limit the fight against the consequences of this leak of information, or if it was necessary to change everything. And to change everything is, by and large, the whole system of encryption, decryption in general, the security of the state secrets of the United States. This was terrible for the entire history of mankind, a terrible leak of information. But what happened now in Russia, it covers almost everything. In general, we will explain the situation, that is, there is a means of deterrence. The most terrible of them in terms of mass, in terms of striking force, is the rockets of the ground base, which are located in the mines. There is no nuclear war of deterrence to this day because there is deterrence works. It works as follows. If, let's say, the Kremlin decided to strike on the United States, they must calculate this in such a way that in the first warning strike, to knock out as many. Rockets as possible first of all on the ground base and preferably also on submarines, so that when something remains, very little should remain, and when it what remains will fly back to Russia. The Russian medium-based anti-missile defense should knock them out. So, in order to make this decision to strike on the enemy, the aggressor must know, he must know a lot about how the defense of these rockets is arranged. Of the ground base, how these mines are arranged, how these hatches work, how they are closed, how they are opened, how the cables fit into these mines. Everything is important there, the smallest detail, because the absence of these details does not allow to calculate whether it is possible and how many rockets can be knocked out in the first strike. That is, ignorance, lack of detailed, accurate information allowed to ensure this restraint and allowed Russia to bluff. On this, Putin has been playing for 3 years. Like we will strike a nuclear strike, there are salamanders, we will destroy the entire Great Britain with our rockets, we will destroy Paris, we will destroy Berlin from the face of the earth. This is all empty chatter. In fact, when a decision is made to strike, especially on the nuclear side, it is done as I have just told you. And so, after deleting these 2 million documents, he gave foreign specialists, the Pentagon, the Ministry of Defense of all other NATO countries, intelligence services, analysts the opportunity to find out about these Russian land-based rockets. Almost everything to calculate what they can, what they cannot, and what is needed in order to destroy them in the first strike. That is, the curtain of secrecy has been removed from them. Well, a detail, let's say this well or silo as it is called, or a power tower as I joke here, because silo sounds in English. That is, this is a mine, this is a whole city, it is horribly fortified, but, and with a blow on it, that is, it is necessary to hit, probably directly, or you can hit right next to it. But then not a 100% guarantee of destruction, but cables come to it. If you know which side it does not fit, you can hit it under the cable and that's it. And it is only on the connection, which means that this mine is inactive and so on. Plus, this information was about 2 regiments in the Orenburg region. But since everything is standard there in Russia and in other countries by and large, that is, it was possible to design how it was with all the land-based rockets. Thus, this veil of secrecy, it has fallen, and now, as this Chinese analyst writes, what can the nuclear power rely on now after it has uncovered all the maps about how it provides deterrence? The real harm from this leak completely destroyed the strategic nuclear forces of Russia. Now they cannot perform a deterrence function because of this leak, if Russia wants to completely neutralize. Or to patch up the loopholes that have formed because of this leak, it must completely rebuild the entire defense mechanism of these rockets. That is, it concerns the restructuring, not just the replacement of the password, not just redesign, how to change something there, but a complete change of architecture is needed. That is, it is necessary to plan and redo it again. That is, it is necessary to go to the computer before the drawing board and rethink and redo it all over again. And the project cycle will last for years and its cost can be billions of dollars. And if we speak seriously, Chinese scientists write,
И если говорить серьезно, пишет китайский ученый,
then it is unlikely
вряд
that the
ли
damage that strategic
тот
forces have
ущерб,
caused to
который
Russia
нанесли
can be turned
стратегические
over
силы
again.
Раши, можно обратить вспять.
Even the
Даже
restructuring of the
перестройка
system will leave
системы
the enemy with
поставит
a hint to
противнику
strike on the
подсказки
deployed Russian
для
nuclear
того,
weapon.
чтобы нанести удар по развернутому российскому ядерному оружию.
As
Как
soon as
только
this
вот эта
uncertainty of
неопределенность
strategic
стратегическая
forces has
исчезла,
disappeared, the deterrence factor
исчез
of the Russian
сдерживающий
strategic
фактор
forces has
российских
disappeared.
стратегических сил.
The decisions
Решения
of the enemy
противников
of
Раши
Russia
теперь
will now
будут
be
более
more
уверенными,
confident, and the
а
possibility
возможность
of warning or
упреждающих или
targeted strikes in
целенаправленных
times of
ударов в
crisis is
кризисные времена
significantly increasing.
в значительной степени увеличивается.
And this is how
И
it
это
ends. That is, this
вот
is a
чем он
catastrophe.
заканчивается.
Now
То
it
есть это
turns out that
катастрофа.
Russia does not
Получается, что
have
у Раши
strategic
нет
deterrence.
стратегического сдерживания.
The
Страна
country is actually
фактически
open by and
открыта,
large for a
по
strike,
большому
and the
счету, для
situation is such that,
удара.
let's say, Russia
И
needs to
ситуация
pray that
такова,
it does.
что, ну, скажем так, на Раши надо молиться, что у него нет
Not
таких
have such
сумасшедших
crazy
врагов, как
enemies
есть у
as the
западной
Western
цивилизации,
civilization
как Северная
has,
Корея,
such as North Korea, let's
или
say, or
тоже
even
та же
Russia.
Раша.
That
То
is
есть
what
то,
the
на чем
Soviet Union was
бился
fighting for
Советский
since the time of
Союз с
making its
момента
nuclear bomb.
изготовления своей ядерной бомбы,
Then the
потом
construction of nuclear
строительство ядерных
forces, which
сил,
eventually
которые
led
были,
to the
так сказать, у
collapse of the
развала
Soviet
Советского Союза,
Union,
все
all of
это
this collapsed
рухнуло
completely.
полностью.
Pupkin turned
Пупкин
out to be
оказался
naked,
с
who
голым,
praised his
который
nuclear
так
forces so much.
хвалился,
He
так
turned out to be
кичился своими
naked in the
ядерными
ass by
силами.
and
Он
large.
оказался с голым задом, по большому счету.
I was
Вот я,
also interested in comments and
заинтересовали еще
readers, but these are
комментарии
not just
читателей.
readers who go
Не
out there
просто
to
читатели,
watch
которые
TikTok and leave comments.
выходят
These
ТикТок
are people
посмотреть
who
и
read from a
комментарии
building
оставить. Это
close to
люди,
the
которые
Academy
читают
of
издания Английской
Sciences.
академии наук
Of
Китая,
China, an ally of Russia,
союзника
writes one of them,
России,
this is really
пишет
shocking, one of the
один из
main
них.
secrets of such a
Это
country.
действительно шокирует. Один из главных секретов такой страны, то есть Раши, оказался,
That is,
что
Russia turned
как
out to be
можно
so
быть
funny,
таким
in fact.
смешным на
This
самом
shows,
деле.
on the other hand, that this country has really
Это
shrunk,
показывает, с другой стороны,
gentlemen.
что эта страна действительно сократилась. Ужалась она, господа.
Another
Другой
writes,
пишет,
Pupkin, attention, this is how it is
на нем
written,
так и написано.
Pupkin, this is a special collective
Это
Pupkin,
особая
this is a
коллективный
special group
Путин,
of
это особая группа товарищей, которая по
comrades
команде
which cannot
свиней
move on the command of
не
pigs. It
может
cannot really
двигаться.
develop
Она
and
не может
move.
по-настоящему развиваться и двигаться.
The third writes,
А,
Pupkin, immerse yourself
Третий
deeply.
пишет,
Russia has
под
lying
своим
loopholes,
погрузитесь
these are
глубоко.
broken
У
barks, gentlemen,
России
my head.
лежачие лохани, лохань, это разбитая корыта, господа. До сих пор
Still
болит
hurts in the
голова
West,
на
that
Западе.
is,
То
such
есть
a
такой
horror
ужас
happens, and at this
происходит,
time they
а
are
в это
doing
время
something there,
они там
fighting with
что-то
the West.
дергаются, с Западом воюют.
Well,
Рвали,
probably,
конечно,
of
на
course, the
самолетных
whole
пометах,
country is being wiped from the
стираются
ground
из
with the
этих целые
half-dusts, and they
страны,
have a
а
naked
у них
ass, you know.
оказывается
And this
голая
is the attitude of
задница, понимаете?
China. That is, the
И вот
Chinese laugh.
это отношение Китая. То есть китайцы смеются, китайцы презирают,
Chinese
китайцы считают,
despise the
что
Chinese
эта
believe
утечка
that this
это
leak is a
крах, по
collapse
большому
by and
счету,
large of the
святая
holy
святых
Russian
рашистской
defense due to
обороны,
which
за
it
счет чего она
exists.
существует.
And she
И
created, with the help of
создала
this
при помощи
bluff
этого
and pressure on
блеф
the West for 3
и
years
давит
without
на
allowing
Запад
him,
уже 3
restraining the
года, не
West from the
позволяя
fact that
ему,
he strangled this Pupkin with one
удерживая
hand.
Запад
Now it
от того,
turns
чтобы он его задушил, этого Пупкина, одной рукой. Теперь,
out
оказывается,
that
этого
this is
всего
not all,
нет.
and this pushed me to
И
historical
это
parallels.
натолкнуло
Well, they are
меня
always
на
conditional historical
исторические параллели.
parallels, you know, but here the
Многие
situation
натолкнуло на
is
исторические параллели, вы знаете, но здесь ситуация такова, что
such that this is not one parallel and not two.
это не
That
одна
is, these
параллель,
are
и
such
не
stable
две.
parallels
То
that
есть
help to
такие
make
устойчивые
historical
параллели,
conclusions.
которые помогают сделать исторический вывод.
The
Смысл
point is
состоит в
that
том, что
Russia has
Раша
always
всегда
lost major
проигрывала
wars, and with a
крупные
crack,
войны,
with
причем
catastrophic
резко,
consequences
с
for itself when
катастрофическими
its
для себя
armed forces.
последствиями, когда ее вооруженные силы
When it was in a
на
military
военно-техническом
technical
плане
plane, turned out to be weaker
оказывалась
than the enemy with whom it
слабее,
was in the
чем
state of war.
противник, с которым она оказалась в состоянии войны.
Let's go back, for example, to the Crimean War of
Вернемся, например, к Крымской войне
1853-1856. In this war, Russia
1851-56
got
года.
involved in its stubbornness, as it
В
often
эту
happened
войну
in
Раша влезла по своей настырности, как это часто бывало в
history.
истории.
The Ottoman Empire still controlled
Османская
large
империя
territories, but
еще
itself was very
контролировала большие
weak for a
территории,
very long
но
time.
сама была очень слаба. Слаба была очень долго.
The Moscow Tsar
Московский
Nikolai
царь
I
Николай
decided to take
I
advantage of
решил
this. At first, he
воспользоваться
decided to
этим.
invite the
Для
British
начала
monarch to
он решил
participate in this.
пригласить британского монарха поучаствовать в этом деле.
Matter, the
Британцы
British
отказались,
refused, and then he
и
began to
тогда
act
он
himself. He led the troops allegedly to protect the Russian-speaking population on the territory that is now being controlled, which occupies Bulgaria, Romania. He does not remind you of anything. He led Russian troops there to protect this population. Well then, Turkey, England, and France came to his aid, and this war began. Sevastopol, you know this story, and so on. Russia suffered a crushing defeat. Why? Because what? It must be said that Nikolai I, when he sailed to London for negotiations on joint actions to shorten the Ottoman Empire, he sailed on a brilliant white ship. He was going to London to see this miracle, a really beautiful ship. The problem was that it was a sailor, and at that time, France, England already had warships on steam engines. They were already destroyers, and this led, in the end, one of the factors. That is, Russia relied mainly on the ship fleet, while Britain and France were already armor-bearers on steam engines. Then, cutting weapons, shooting weapons. Russia, the troops were armed with muskets with a range of 100–300 meters. But at that time, the French and the English had a rifle with a cutter, a rifle by the Minier Company, which fired at 1,000 meters. Well, plus logistics, the Allies built an iron road from Balaclava to Sevastopol, and Russia provided the supply of everything necessary on the wagons that were powered by the shafts. And as a result, there was also a colossal artillery advantage for the Allies. They had a more powerful artillery installed on these frigates and armor-bearers. They were much more maneuverable ships, and as a result, a terrible defeat from which Russia was then entangled for at least 20 years. Concentrated, as the minister Gorchakov called it. Then followed the Russian-Japanese War of 1905, and there was also a severe defeat which led to the First Russian Revolution. Russia already had a powerful fleet, but it was morally outdated. Many ships were built in different countries, had different caliber guns. There was poor coordination between them. The Japanese had a first-class navy. They had radio reconnaissance decryptors at the time when the Russian fleet did not even have communication between ships and ground troops. Well, in Japan, not long before that, a reform was carried out. The army was rebuilt, the officer corps was built according to the Russian method. They acted as European armed forces. The Japanese fleet was homogeneous, that is, ships were produced on shipyards in Japan. They were more fast-moving, better optics, better control systems. The result was Suzima. Now, when comparing the recent impact or powerful blow of Ukrainian drones on the airfields and on the so-called peaceful bombers of Russia at these airfields, many have said that they are Pearl Harbor. I like Suzima more because after Pearl Harbor, the Americans recovered and defeated the aggressor, that is, the Japanese. But Suzima is what led to the defeat of Russia in the First Russian Revolution. The consequences would be much worse if America had not intervened then. It was then the progenitor of Trump who intervened in the mediocrity and helped Russia get out of this tough defeat with less losses than they could have been. This is the historical situation, that is, Russia always loses toughly.
плохая ситуация в военно-технической области. Когда
When it
оказывается,
turns
что
out that
Russia
Russia
готова
is
к
ready for the
прошлой войне,
last
в то
war, at a
время как
time when
мир
the world
уже
is already preparing for a
готовится к
new
новой
war.
войне.
By
Кстати
the way,
сказать,
the same
кажется, ситуация была
situation
по
was
большому
by
счету в
and
Советском
large
Союзе
in the
накануне
Soviet
Второй мировой
Union on the
войны.
eve of the Second
Не
World
зря
War.
там идут
If there were no
какие-то
disputes,
споры,
we would have
что
one if
было
there
бы
were
мы
no
выиграли,
allies.
если бы не было бы союзников. Если бы не было
My
бы
father, a
союзников,
participant in
мой
the Great
отец,
Patriotic War, who
участник Великой
came,
Отечественной
often took
войны,
part
который
in the
прошел,
liberation of Budapest, was wounded
участвовал во
there on the
освобождении Будапешта, был ранен там на мосту, любил
bridge,
слушать его
loved to
рассказы,
listen to his
он
stories.
рассказывал с
He told that there were
опорки
no boots at
сначала.
first, there was nothing to
Не в
wear,
чем
there were
было,
no shoes, there was nothing to
обуви не
fight
было,
in,
не в
and there
чем
was
было
nothing
воевать,
to
и
fight
нечем
in.
было воевать. И
If
если
it
бы
were
не эта
not for this
американская
American
помощь,
aid, the
то «Катюши»
Katyushas would
бы
have been
возили бы
carried
на
on
телегах,
carts, strapped
запряженных
by
валами,
poles, like the
как Крымскую
Crimean War of
войну
the 19th
19 века.
century, not to
Не говоря
mention
уже о
other
других
types
там
of weapons. Well, okay, let's forget about it. That is,
видах
we will not
вооружений.
forget, we will
Ну ладно,
remember,
бог
but
с
let's
ним.
move from history to
Забудем, то есть не
modernity.
забудем, будем помнить, но перейдем от истории к современности.
Remember, in the spring of 1923,
Вспомните
Ukraine is preparing for a counteroffensive
весну
with great
23
participation, not only in
Украина
terms of
готовится
supply
к
of
контрнаступлению при большом участии, не только там в плане поставок
weapons,
вооружения,
but
а, так
so to
сказать,
speak,
интеллектуальном
intellectual
участии
participation of the NATO
штабов
countries,
стран
the
НАТО,
Pentagon.
Пентагона. Речь
We are talking
идет
about
о
giving us
том, дайте
500
нам
tanks,
там
600 armored
500
personnel
танков,
carriers, give us
600
2,000 planes.
бронетранспортеров,
Well,
дайте
remember,
нам
then these
2000
numbers, I am now
самолетов. Ну,
conditionally,
помните,
maybe
тогда эти
exaggerating, but
цифры,
it is not in vain
может
that
быть, утрирую,
I
но это
am
неизвестно
exaggerating, then you will
примерно
understand
почему.
why. There was a
Речь шла
supply
тогда о
of necessary
необходимых
supplies, a
поставках
huge number of
громадного
heavy aviation techniques,
количества
well, and
тяжелой
what was the
техники
idea?
авиации.
An organization
Ну
of
и идея-то какая была? Организация
a powerful
мощного
general
общего
military strike in
войскового
one
удара в
direction, in
одном
which there should have been
направлении, в котором
involved this
должны были
innumerable
участвовать
number
это
of live forces and equipment.
немеренное количество живой силы и техники.
Well, you understand, remember
Ну,
that
вы
this is an
помните,
offensive that began
что
exactly according to the
это
advice, those advice that were
наступление,
received from
которое начали-то именно по советам, тем советам, которые были получены из Пентагона
the
и
Pentagon
из
and from Wiesbaden
Висбадена
and
и
Stuttgart.
Штутгарта.
This offensive was not as successful as
Это
expected.
наступление не было настолько успешным, как ожидалось.
Although I
Хотя
will
не
remind
напомню
you
вам,
that in this
что
offensive,
в этом
significant parts of the
наступлении
Russian
были
territory were
освобождены
liberated,
значительные
the enemy
части
was
российской
abandoned,
территории.
well, not
Враг
as
был
ambitious as
отброшен,
you would
но
like,
не
but was
так
abandoned.
амбициозно, как хотелось бы, но был отброшен.
They removed Zaluzhny
Сняли
because
Залужного,
allegedly
потому
he
что
did not
якобы
strive for
не
offensive
стремился
actions.
к
They put
наступательным
you-know-who
действиям.
since then.
Поставили, вы знаете кого, и с тех пор
And
до
until
сих
now,
пор
the constant
продолжается
retreat and loss of
неуклонное
Russian
отступление
Ukrainian
и потеря
territories
российских
continues. And
украинских
Zaluzhny
территорий.
wrote an article on this
Значит,
issue,
а Залужный написал статью по этому
in which,
поводу,
well, for the
в
first
которой,
time maybe, the theme was voiced,
впервые,
win the one
может
who
быть,
has the new, the
прозвучала
best
тема,
technology.
что выиграет тот, у кого будет новая, лучшая технология.
Zaluzhny
Залужный
wrote that the
написал,
technologies in this
технологии в
war will
этой
solve
войне решат
everything.
все.
New,
Новые,
unknown, those that
неизвестные,
will provide
те,
an
которые
advantage. Here is such an advantage as
обеспечат
it was with the Allies, as it
такое
was with the
преимущество, как было у союзников, как было у японцев в 19 веке.
Japanese in the 19th
Это было
century.
гениальное
It was a
предвидение,
brilliant
потому
foresight
что,
because the Pentagon, the
повторяю,
NATO staff, they
Пентагон,
acted on the
штабы
basis of
НАТО,
the
они
experience of the
действовали на
Second
основе
World War.
опыта Второй мировой войны.
The
Последний
last
раз
time
такие
such
общевойсковые
general
действия
military
применялись
actions were used by
американцами в
the
ходе
Americans in the course of the Berry Desert against Saddam
пустыни против
Hussein.
Саддама Хусейна. А тут
But then it
оказалось
turned
совсем
out to be
другое.
completely
И
different, and Zaluzhny
был
was the first
первым,
who, for many,
который
many months, if not
много
years in
месяцев
advance,
так,
predicted that a
годов
technological
вперед
breakthrough was needed.
предсказал, что нужен технологический прорыв. Вот это
You are
должно
the one who must
оказаться
be in
на
charge of
месте.
the
И
armed
дальше я вам расскажу.
forces. And then
Сейчас
I will tell
пишут
you, now the generals of Israel write analyses
генералы
about where
израильские анализы о том,
the
куда
development of
сейчас
this
пошло
new
развитие вот
technology
этой
has
новой
now gone,
техники.
the development of this general foresight of Zaluzhny.
Развитие этого гениального предвидения Залужного. Вот
It is
сейчас
only
вот до
now
этого
that this is thought
додумалось.
out. Zaluzhny
Залужный
thought about it
додумался до
back in
этого еще
1923,
в
but he could not
23-м
accomplish this because,
году. Осуществить этого не смог, потому что, знаете,
they replaced
замедлили
it. There were
программы.
problems with the ratings, as you
Проблемы
know. They
рейтингов,
worried about someone.
как известно. Они кое-кого волновали. Ну, а
And now,
теперь,
what do
значит,
we
что
have?
мы
Now I
имеем?
have mentioned to
Теперь
you
вот
General Major
я вам
Zapasa, the
упомянул
army of the
генерал-майор
Israeli Armed
Запаса,
Forces, a
армия
doctor of military
вооруженных сил Израиля, доктор военных наук
sciences
Яков
Yakov
Бонжо.
Bonjo. He published an article. It was on
Он
May 19 of this year in the
опубликовал статью, было это дело 19 мая этого года
military journal of the Israeli
журнале,
armed
военном
forces
журнале
called
вооруженных сил
Merahot, in
Израиля
which he
под
described the colossal
названием
breakthrough that took
«Марахот»,
place after.
который он описал вот тот колоссальный прорыв, который произошел
These articles of
после
General Zaluzhny, here
этих
is what I will
статей
tell you
генерала
briefly. A
Залужного.
large article, if you
Вот
find it,
сегодня
it is
вкратце
already
все.
somewhere
Большая
in Russian
статья, если
translation,
найдете,
in
она где-то
Ukrainian.
гуляет уже в русском переводе, в украинском переводе,
Translation in the
в
information space.
информационном пространстве.
The main position, Ukraine
А,
is the first
Основные
army, but Russia
положения.
is also.
Украина– это первая армия, но за ней Россия тоже последовала, которая массово использует а, вот эти дроны, которые
Behind it, which
называются
massively
First
uses these
Person
drones, which are
View.
called
Это
first.
дроны прямого видения, когда оператор, управляющий этим дроном, на дроне стоит телекамера.
Person view, these are drones of direct
Оператор
vision.
своими
When the operator who
глазами
controls these
присутствует на
drones, on the
поле
drone
боя,
there's a camera,
управляет
the operator with his own eyes, he's present on the
инструментом
battlefield and
уничтожения
controls this tool of
противника
destruction of the
на
enemy.
многие
For many
километры
kilometers from the
от того
place
места,
where
где
he
он
is
находится.
located. This is not just a new
Это не просто
weapon,
новое
writes the
оружие,
Israeli
пишут
general major. This is a
израильский
revolution in the
генерал-майор.
military
Это
business.
революция в военном деле.
Old
Старая
military
доктрина
doctrines,
против
pay
нее
attention.
могла
I will not
только в
tell you the
Китае. Я
details,
расскажу
I will
вообще
tell you the
назначение
meaning so
этого
that you understand.
Старые
Old
военные
military
доктрины
doctrines
больше,
do not
доктрины
act
больше не
anymore. The very
действуют.
basis of tactics is
Полностью изменяется
completely
сама
changing.
основа
Revolutionary changes are changes
Революционным
in the
изменением
architecture of
является
the front line
изменение самой
itself.
архитектуры линии фронта.
Now the front
Теперь
line is a
линия
40-kilometer
фронта – это
crater of death, where being
40-километровый
in an open
кратер
space for at
смерти,
least 15
где
minutes leads
нахождение
to
на открытом
inevitable death.
пространстве хотя бы
This
15 минут приводит к неминуемой гибели.
is
Вот
what
что
these
делают эти
drones of
дроны
direct vision do. They
прямого видения.
violated the main foundation
Они
of the classical
нарушили главный
military thought, the
фундамент классической
concentration of
военной
forces and
мысли,
equipment on
концентрацию
specific sites.
сил
On the
и живой силы и техники на конкретных участках.
modern
На
battlefields, you
современном
cannot
поле
deploy
боя вы
and
не можете
concentrate
развернуть
forces
и
more than a company.
сконцентрировать
I
силы
draw your
больше, чем
attention.
рота. Обращаю на ваше внимание.
Pentagon NATO gave advice to the
Пентагон,
general-in-chief to
НАТО
concentrate.
давали советы генералу Залужному концентрировать вообще все, что у него было, на
Everything he
одном
had on one
участке и
site
там
and achieve a
добиваться
breakthrough
прорыва. То
there.
есть
That is, they did not
они не
understand by
понимали,
and
по большому
large the
счету, той
situation that happened
ситуации,
at that
которая
time.
сложилась к этому
Drones,
времени.
they changed all this.
Дроны, они поменяли все
Now
это.
pay attention. Who
Теперь
hears no one is
обратите
required to
внимание,
give us
кто
hundreds of
слышит,
tanks like
никто больше не
transporters,
требует дать
even
нам
about
сотни
planes, so
автобусов
by and
транспорта.
large everyone
Вот
is
насчет
quiet,
самолетов, так
because the
прошу
tanks are buried in the ground. The
потому что танки врыты в землю, самолеты стоят в основном
planes are
где-то
mostly somewhere on the
аэродромах, они
airfields,
не
and they do
действуют
not
за
act
линией
beyond the
фронта
front line in the
в
airspace of
воздушном
the
пространстве
enemy.
противника.
Everything was
Все
mixed in the house of
совершалось в доме
Oblonsky.
Облонских.
Now the company,
Теперь
that's it.
рота.
What
Вот
is
и
the
все.
company?
Что
It
такое
means
рота?
small
Это значит
runs.
мелкими перебежками. Вот
That's why this
почему
offensive is
медленно
going
идет это
slowly. When
наступление,
Pupkin
когда
says that
Путин
we will get
говорит, что
somewhere
мы
there, they will
дойдем
get somewhere
куда-то,
there
мы
for
до
another
этого куда-то
300
будем
years.
доходить еще 300
And they
лет.
will not get
И
there
не
because
дойдут,
other
потому
events
что
will take
произойдут
place, which
другие
I will
события,
say
которые я
further.
расскажу дальше.
The offensive is now
Наступление
based on the
теперь опирается на
concentration of fire
концентрацию
and the means
огня
of
и средств
defeat, and not
поражения,
on the
а не
concentration of
концентрацию
forces, a
сил,
large number of
большого
forces,
количества
and their
сил и
maneuvers.
их
This
маневров.
led to the fact that the
Это привело к
offensive is
тому,
moving
что
extremely
наступающий
slowly.
продвигается крайне медленно.
Here is an
Вот вам
explanation
объяснение,
why the orcs
почему
are
орки
crawling.
ползут.
Since the offensive is
Так
based on
как
small units, a maximum of a
наступающий
company.
опирается на малые отряды, максимум рота.
This is the whole
Вот он
potential
и
that
весь
is coming. That
наступающий
is a
потенциал.
revolution.
То есть действительно произошла революция. Это только то, что касается дронов прямого вида.
Really took place. This is only what concerns the direct view
Поэтому я бы
drones.
добавил тут израильским генералам, что вот эта революция, она привела еще к тому, что наступающий, в данном случае вообще орки,
Therefore, I would add to the
они
Israeli generals that this revolution also led to
колоссально
the fact that the orcs, in
увеличили
this case,
свои
they colossally
потери
increased their
живой
losses
силы.
with the help of the living force.
И вот с
And
этой
with this revolution,
революцией
the numbers of their
возросли
losses
и
also
цифры их
increased.
потерь. Все
Everyone was
удивлялись,
surprised.
откуда
Where
они,
did they come from?
почему
Why
это,
is
а
this?
вот
And this
откуда
is
они
where they came from.
взялись.
The
Израильский
Israeli
генерал все
general
объясняет.
explains
Это следствие
everything. This is
неизбежной
the
революции.
consequence
И
of an
дальше,
inevitable
и дальше
revolution,
будет еще
and then it
хуже.
will be even
То
worse.
есть
That
поле
is, the
боя
battlefield
на
and the
территории
territory of
Украины
Ukraine
превратилось
turned into
в
a meat grinder of
мясорубку
orcs.
орков. И
And how
сколько
many
орки
orcs will be able
смогут
to put meat
поставлять
into this meat
мясо в
grinder?
эту
This is a question. Kupkin is still there, laughing, jumping, but
это
it
вопрос. Пупкин пока там хорохорится, пока пыжится, но бесконечно это
can't
продолжаться
go
не
on
может.
forever.
Рано или
Sooner or
поздно это
later, it
все
will all
закончится,
end.
потому
Because
что
now the whole idea of those people,
ведь
of the
сейчас вся
institutions that
мысль
are working on the
тех людей,
development of this
институтов, которые
revolution now
работают
and
над
they
развитием вот этой революция сейчас в военно-техническом деле направлена на то,
Military technical
чтобы
field is aimed at the ratio of the number of orcs that will be destroyed for the
соотношение
promotion to a certain distance.
количества
So,
орков, которые будут уничтожены за продвижение на определенную дистанцию,
that this number
это
increases, and
количество
now for the
увеличивается.
occupation of
Сейчас
1 kilometer of new
для
territory,
занятия, подсчитано,
167
для
orcs
занятия 1 километра новой территории должны отдать свои
must
жизни
give their lives. This is a
167
lot,
орков. Это
It
много,
must be
очень много.
assumed that in the
Надо
near
полагать,
future
что
this
и в
number will
ближайшее
increase and
время
will
это
continue to
количество будет
increase.
увеличено и будет продолжаться увеличиваться.
Finally, these Israeli
Наконец-то,
generals write about
эти
those
генералы
drones that were
израильские, они пишут еще о тех дронах, которые управлялись при помощи спутников,
controlled by
решетки,
satellites and also by
но и
the
при
optics of
помощи
these
еще
fibers. They had two problems, these
самых
drones. The first is that they
волокон.
were
То есть они имели две проблемы, эти дроны. Первое – это они были
subject to
подвержены
the impact of the RAB system, and since they
воздействию
began to
систем РЭБ,
operate, Russia has deployed
и
a large
Раша
number of
с тех
RAB
пор, как они начали
installations.
действовать, развернула большое количество установок РЭБ вокруг
Around its
стратегических
strategic facilities, such
объектов
as
своих,
airfields,
как
probably air
аэродромы,
bases, then oil bases, and the largest
эти
cities,
самые
Moscow, of
авиабазы,
course.
затем нефтяные, наверное, базы, ну и крупнейшие города, Москва, естественно.
And some time
И
ago, a couple of months
некоторое время
ago,
назад,
there were talks
месяца
that the
назад или
effectiveness of
разговоры
the
шли
RAB
о
system
действии.
increased for orcs.
Эффективность системы РЭБ увеличилась у орков.
And the second
А
limitation of the
вторая,
problem
значит,
is the length
ограничение
of this
проблемы
fiber
это вот
optic thread.
длина
After all,
этой
it is
нити
limited.
оптиковолокнистой. Все-таки как-никак, но она ограничена.
And now this
И
is
вот
the first
теперь
mass,
это
very
первый в
effective
истории
blow in history at the
массовый,
greatest
весьма
distance
эффективный
that
удар,
Ukrainian drones have
огромнейшего
hit enemy
расстояния,
airfields.
который украинские дроны нанесли по аэродромам врага.
There were a lot of debates about
Было
how these
много
drones were
дебатов,
controlled. Most said that they
чем
were satellites from
управлялись эти
one
дроны.
place to another,
Большинство
that is,
говорили, что
American.
это
But how
спутники,
American? Did Trump agree to
туда-сюда,
this? And then
здесь
he
американские, а как американские, неужели Трамп согласился на это?
was not
Назначили
told,
ему
or he was
сказали, ему
told that it was
сказали,
either
это
a British
американский
satellite.
спутник.
This is
То
already
есть уже
established
как
as a
факт
fact.
установлено,
Yes, in fact, channels
ну,
of
собственно
information
говоря,
leakage from the
каналы
Ukrainian special
утечки
services reported that
информации из спецслужб Украины
these drones were controlled by
оповестили,
artificial
эти дроны
intelligence.
управлялись
American
искусственным
specialists say
интеллектом.
that the last mile to
Американские
the goal,
специалисты
these
говорят,
drones flew on
последнюю
artificial
милю
intelligence.
до цели
What is the
эти
last
дроны
mile?
летели
This
на
is how.
искусственном интеллекте. А что такое последняя миля? Это вот
They
как
flew
они
out of these
вылетели из этих
boxes. All this, they
ящиков.
flew on
Вот
artificial
все это они летели
intelligence.
на
That is
искусственном
why they
интеллекте.
overcame the
Именно
system for the
поэтому они
sake of
преодолели
electronic
систему
warfare.
радиоэлектронной борьбы.
That is,
То есть
now
теперь
Putin's ass is not
задница
only in the
Путина,
strategic plan,
она
due
не
to the
только в
fact that
стратегическом
now
плане,
everything is known
из-за
where the
того, что теперь
vulnerable
все
points of
известно, где
strategic missiles are
уязвимые
located,
места у
ground-based.
стратегических ракет наземного базирования.
Now it
Теперь
turns out that
оказывается
the
и
RAP does
РЭП не
not work.
работает.
The RAP
Не
does not
работает
work.
РЭП.
That is, it is
Надо
necessary to
наращивать
increase the
количество
number of Ukrainian
украинских
UAVs. It is necessary to
беспилотников,
improve
надо
the system of
совершенствовать систему
artificial
искусственного
intelligence.
интеллекта. И
And the case will
дело
go, the case will
пойдет.
become, everything will
Дело
become
станет,
much more
все станет
effective.
гораздо более эффективным.
By the way, some observers noticed when these
Кстати, некоторые
videos appeared
наблюдатели
about
обратили внимание, когда появились вот эти видео о том, как украинские дроны
how
передвигаются
Ukrainian
по
drones
бомбардировщикам
approach the
целям.
purpose of the
Было
bombers.
заметно,
It
что
was
они
noticeable that they do not hit the
не
bombers with the
бьют
purpose that is
по тем
already hit and
бомбардировщикам, по тем
damaged.
целям, которые уже подбиты и повреждены.
From this, they believed
Из
that they
этого
were
считали, что
controlling live
значит,
operators.
управляют
No,
живую
artificial
гарантию.
intelligence has come to the
Нет,
point that it now
искусственный интеллект дошел
distinguishes.
до того, что он теперь отличает бутафорскую цепь
A
от
metaphoric duck from a
подсадную,
rubber plane or
излечимую
tank from the
самолет
real
летает
one, a wrecked plane from a non-wrecked
от
one. That
настоящего,
is, remember, I
подбитый
told you.
самолет от неподбитого. То есть, запомните, я вам когда-то говорил,
Once the
возможность
possibility of
искусственного
artificial
интеллекта,
intelligence
она
doubles every
удваивается
5.7
каждые
months.
5,7 месяца.
Now
Сейчас
Ukraine, let's say the
Украина,
United States,
скажем
and
так,
thanks to this,
Соединенные
according to
Штаты,
the Association of Ukraine,
благодаря
has an
этому
advantage.
ассоциация
This
с
is how
Украиной
American
имеет
specialists in
преимущество,
the field of
как американские
artificial intelligence
специалисты в
say.
области искусственного интеллекта говорят.
The
Преимущество
advantage
над
over
Рашей
Russia
и
and
Китаем
China is
примерно
about 5-7
5-10 лет.
years, and this
И вот
gap
этот
failure,
гэп
it is almost
провал, его
impossible to patch it up.
невозможно практически залатать.
Because while they are there, first of
Пока
all in
они
China,
там
Russia has no
бездельничают в
time to
Китае,
deal
Раша
with
будет
it.
этим
They will catch
заниматься.
up to the current state of
Они будут догонять до нынешнего
Ukraine
состояния.
and the United States of America. those in this time will double their advantage in 5.7 months, and so it will last by and large to infinity. This is, in fact, the law of the development of artificial intelligence. So what does Ukraine help in all this? A close cooperation with leaders, world leaders in the field of the use of artificial intelligence in the military. I will not call you these companies, I will not call specifically those platforms that are being made, which they have already produced, which is being used, those types of weapons that are being used. Well, I'll just say it like this, I repeat, all this is in an open space, but still, we will not, so to speak, fall prey to the the system of smoke, the smoke weight of secrecy. We will not go after orcs who display their complete secrets and documents in millions. I will just explain what is happening. Here is one of the companies. It brought the analytics of artificial intelligence in real time on the battlefield. This is operating software that tracks the goals and risks according to the goals. And in general, how it works, kill the first. This system, it allows when the fight of drones between themselves begins and so on to make the first warning strike. The leader of the company in the world in this area. Another one, it introduces autonomous drones, laser systems, air defense systems, systems of command of the next generation, gentlemen of the next generation. These private players, they are not associated with much. This is not a state company, a private company, and they became allies of Ukraine. At the same time, they often overtake NATO in terms of adaptation of the latest achievements of artificial intelligence, and in general, technology overtakes NATO in the pace of adaptation. Who quickly adapts these latest achievements? I repeat, now they are rapidly doubling every 5.7 months. What happens as a result of all this? There is a collapse of Russian strategic ambitions. Russia is technically unable to compete with the combination of these direct vision drones plus artificial intelligence plus autonomy. That is, they work on artificial intelligence in an autonomous mode. Russia is unable to compete with this now. It is this combination of three things that has ensured the success of the strike on Russian airfields. Then, as the Chinese and American experts would read, it all happens when a stream of nuclear drawings that, from the point of view of the Chinese, symbolizes the collapse of the state machine of Russia. Well, because this is degeneration, this manifestation is no longer just some kind of disadvantage. Well, okay, Snowden ran away, something else, and then for a long time this is all laid out. This is the degeneration of the state apparatus. The Americans consider this, the NATO members, as a symptom of a systemic catastrophe. I emphasize, a catastrophe. China, in this situation, it kind of goes back. It sees that Russia is actually a losing power. I read you there in the comments, it is a scourge, it is a cracked scourge. Therefore, this is not an ally, this is a scourge. This is a scourge for China, and from this China will build and will build its strategy. Therefore, in this situation, a new strategic situation that has arisen now. The United States and its allies, but there is a question. Without Trump, this question still remains open, although he, as it is known, Is a substance in a hole, then there. Everyone tries to blow so that he can swim where necessary. Well, so far an unpredictable, so to speak, magnitude, but without this you can do without. So the USA is a deep state, and those who are engaged in this, so far, I recently saw a video of the defense minister of the United States, Hexet. He trained Marine infantry. There is their department, probably there are 10 people. And so they run along the coast, there is the ocean, they have such a run. And he runs from behind, you know, like in a movie about these very American special forces under command. They shout out some slogans. I watched. But this is idiocy. Here is the degeneration of the system, you know. This person must lead such a machine. He must deal with these issues. And what he is doing now is a witness to the fact that he does not understand what to do for the position of the minister. Therefore, he is engaged in this bullshit, just bullshit, just bullshit. And if he had a smart boss, he would have forbidden him to appear on the screen at all, TV, especially to record such nonsense. Next, the situation has developed in such a way that allies and so, to speak, reasonable elements of the national security system of the United States of America, they are now moving on to a new strategy, which is based on technology, not bureaucracy. I repeat why, because the leaders now, always in history, the leaders were the state was the client. Remember the Manhattan Project, how it all happened. Now the leaders are corporations, the private sector. These are technologies and those who develop them, and not the official world. Not the state, not bureaucracy. This is also very important now, when we see all these often undesirable moves of the White House. Well, the conclusion, here is the situation. What is happening? In front of Russia, like on the battlefield in Ukraine, this 40-kilometer crater of death on the front line, this crater of death was formed in front of Putin's Russia. Instead of the victory that he resists, there is a crater of death in front of him. The modern front line is not territory, but digital. Space now, gentlemen, that's what he doesn't understand. He struggles. You know, when there is such a revolution, the orcs are now fighting for small Ukrainian villages, even these small villages. That is, they are not fighting for those goals where their fate will be decided. Now not the one who has more soldiers is winning, but the one who has more and more advanced algorithms. Russia is doomed to defeat not because it is weak, but because it is too old-fashioned. And do you remember how I told you an anecdote about Karlik? Karlik was strong, but he turned out to be light. This is what the pale mule expects. As I told you, world leaders in the field of using artificial intelligence for military purposes are working with Ukraine now. They are developing the following technologies, again based on open sources. First of all, a platform that creates the opportunity for David to winning his Goliath. And this is done thanks to platforms that unwind goals, instructions, and counterattacks, and for Ukraine they have become faster and more accurate than for the enemy, and then this trend will increase in favor of Ukraine. Now these platforms are integrated into the NATO system. Thus, through these platforms, Ukraine is already actually integrated into this system, into the defense system of the alliance. And all this creates the possibility of accelerating decisions, reducing losses, strengthening the mental predictability of the situation. Here I still have a lot of what exactly this is all done. I'm afraid to even call it. Although there is all this, but if you connect it all together, then it turns out a dialogue into a murderous picture. Now the interceptors of artificial intelligence have already been developed to protect. Against drones and missiles, a whole complex is taking place which is called the murder of the interceptor. That is, the killing. The killing means the destruction. Of the living force and the technique of the enemy, and the systems are being developed, they are already actually unfolding, which provide full coverage of threats. That is, as I understand it, there is no full decoding, probably a big secret, but if they write full coverage of threats to the territory, then this means full control over the corresponding territory and airspace. Therefore, gentlemen, these companies individually give Ukraine technological superiority, accuracy, speed, and autonomy. Together, they create a digital shield and a sword, in a chain of intelligence, attack, defense, and all this in one unified tactical digital space. This, gentlemen, is the technological revolution, and the initiatives in this revolution go to Ukraine. That is, Russia can still increase the number of drones, but the brain of these drones will be, it is clear, much smaller. That is, the classic strategy of Russia. It turns out where everything is taken on the number of living forces, on the number of technology, it turns out to be in the trap of outdated approaches. Therefore, I come from optimistic, careful optimism, but from a realistic scenario. The most powerful technological companies of the military purpose of the West are already built into the Ukrainian defense architecture. They consider the support of Ukraine as a question of a historical mission, not a changeable policy. And this is especially important now when the incomprehensible winds are blowing from Potomac or Potomac. When one day there is a good statement, the other day there is a bad statement, then an unexpected decision to change something to the Middle East. This, again on a large scale, seems to be a fly's nest, because another element of the tragic situation that has occurred, the fate of the outcome of this war, the people say, the common people or the domestic, I would say, wars of Ukraine against the aggressor, is that the will of one person, even if this person is sitting in the White House, the end result does not depend. There are independent forces that are already built into the defense system of the entire Western world, and the White House, with all its desire, cannot shut it all down. Therefore, we would have a day to stand and a night to hold on. Truth is on our side and technological progress, and this decides everything. History speaks of this. General Zaluzhny wrote about this in his time when no one had any idea about this, even at the headquarters in the NATO countries. Well, in conclusion, this is the story of some sources that sympathize with Ukraine, although China will not say about this. China, you see, they have written Russia off from a number of serious states. Locks, that's what they see. That is, the Chinese scientist, commentator of the Academy of Sciences, believes that Russia is already a off-country from the point of strategic nuclear point of view. And also, after Russia started aggression against Ukraine, Putin also said in an impromptu that to establish close allied relations with China, we went to the point that we helped China to make a system against missile defense and create a system of ICBM, intercontinental ballistic missiles. And Russia sold its most secret secrets, which were later leaked through the corresponding state server. That is, China now understands everything, and it does not want to have anything in common with this country. In a big way, in a strategic sense, because it deals with idiots with excess chromosomes. Because, I repeat, Chinese politicians and scientists treat this as a collapse of the system from which there is no return, because you have to change everything, starting with a drawing board. Well, in conclusion, I will still give you the opinion of one person. His name is Sergey Markov, a representative of Arkansas, and from my observation, he has been spinning in my field of view for a long time. Because of what he does, I treat him as a channel for the implementation of active measures, the Kremlin, Russian special services. This is a person who, when Russia had good relations with America, when America fed Russia, he was a Western, he was an American, a favorite of America, and then the winds changed, he changed. But he was regularly one of the Earth's objectors, regularly went to the American embassy to send, apparently, some certain information. That is, he was a specialist in sending orderly information. He did not send it so bluntly as to send it in orderly, because he sent it in orderly for the orcs, for the internal audience, for the morons. There they shout that the Great Britain is a garbage from the face of the earth, London and Paris, and this one is thinner, let's say. Who was thinner? That is, for the ears of Western analysts and politicians, he delivered information. But I always repeat, it was in the Russian Western interests of the Kremlin, and suddenly the thunder in the middle of the clear sky. I get the information he posted on his page on the Telegram channel. I don't know what to call it, the coat of arms or something. He writes about the state of the DPRK and says, what is happening now with Russia, with its influence? Look, Kazakhstan. Russia has helped to preserve the regime, led the troops there under the guise of the DPRK troops. They put this president, or gave him the opportunity, to become the new president. And what do we see? On the one hand, Kazakhstan turned in the direction of China, on the other hand, completely in the direction of Europe. That is, here are two brothers on the one side of Europe, on the other side of China. Russia is not there. That is, Russia, as he writes, is practically a lost position in Kazakhstan. Azerbaijan, he says, Azerbaijan openly sends Moscow, especially after Russia shot down the plane. Azerbaijan openly supports Ukraine, and this is done, he writes, even boldly by President Aliyev. Armenia, the same thing. Pashinyan takes his representative out of the DPRK. That is, Armenia is practically not present in this organization. Uzbekistan is also a tense relationship, and everything is getting worse. That is, Russia lost the DPRK as follows from this opus of Mr. Markov. And then Syria. How many forces means time were killed in order to take over Russian positions. Now they drive out Russia. All its supporters are dying there in one way or another. Syria is also lost. He has not gone further. It is not possible, of course, to grasp everything in one direction, but Russia is now rolling out from Africa. Russia is in the face of Wagner. He is significantly returning to his presence. Well, and so on. That is, the general conclusion of Mr. Markov is that ambitions, or the pressure of strategic Russia, is now spread not further than several Ukrainian villages, as he wrote. Well, excuse me, the name of the villages in Ukraine. No villages, he means tiny villages or settlements, and the whole limit of the strategic ambitions of the great Russian Empire under the leadership of the Emperor of the Pale Mall. This is the situation, gentlemen. I will see, I will continue, I will. Follow this scientific and technical revolution in military affairs. I am watching the development of events in this area, and as the information that can be shared is delivered, I will definitely do it with you. And the poet for now, gentlemen, keep it up. Glory to Ukraine and the armed forces. Time is working for Ukraine. Russia, as the Chinese comrades of Russia say, is already at a broken cart. Glory to Ukraine and the armed forces. The enemy will be broken. Victory will be ours. To you, dear friends, endurance, courage, and firm faith in our inevitable victory. See you soon.
До новых скорых встреч.